Conversations in Society. We talk racism, culture, politics, and economics, the issues that matter to you. Hi, I'm Danielle, and I'm the founder of In Society and host of this podcast. And thank you for listening to Conversations in Society. So we talk about racial equality, culture, politics, the economy, and things that matter to us as marginalized ethnic people living in the UK. So we want to amplify the voices of the overlooked. So this episode, we've got the general elections upcoming, so this is looking at what are the various political parties pledging in their manifestos, what are the leaders' backgrounds, and how voting works, and how that actually matters to people on the ground, such as myself and you who are listening. So today, I'm here with Leah Mahon, a journalist, previously worked with The Voice newspaper, BBC Radio 5, and currently working with the local government sector. Welcome.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Awesome. So, girl, how are you feeling? By the way, me and Leah, we met each other way back in the day when we went to college together. So expect this to be kind of like it's just a back and forth conversation, this one. So How are you feeling about the general elections before we get into what the manifestos say?
How am I feeling? I've actually never voted in an election. I'm very ashamed to say this.
Offensive.
I know. I've actually never voted in any election, not even local. So this will be my first time voting. I'm committed to voting this year. And so I'm actually feeling quite positive about it. I feel like I want to really look and do a deep dive into what the parties are saying. I've never been more involved in politics just from my work as a journalist and now in particular working in local government. So I feel like I'm more personally equipped now to give a good take on where I think the country should be steered. So I'm excited, positive.
Right, so let's just dive straight in, shall we? There's so much to go through, but I think let's get a start on maybe a reminder of what's happened for the racial equality kind of like fight in the UK. Should we remind ourselves of what's happened over the last 15 years?
Absolutely, yeah.
So over the last 15 years, we've seen a series of scandals, but we'll come back to that in a bit. But more around the anti-racism campaigns, moments and news in the world. We've seen in 2016 the Black Lives Matter protesting, and that was in regards to police reform and the legacy of colonialism. Do you kind of remember that time back in 2016?
I remember that. Yeah, I remember the first sort of Black Lives Matter protest in the UK. And it was just such a contrast to the protests we had most recently in 2020 and how they were responded to.
Absolutely, yeah, because it's quite interesting, isn't it? That was also around police reform. And then in 2020, it was more of the global response, to the disgusting murder of George Floyd over in the US. But of course, we felt it as well because, the issue with the police is not an issue just over in the US, is it? It's an issue in the UK. It's an issue in multiple places internationally. And it was also during an interesting time because we were also already having a lot of discussion and becoming more aware of the fact that there was disproportionate rate of Black and brown faces being represented in the hospital dying from COVID, and the lack of response from the government to be a little bit more like, come on, let's do something about this, and who's on the front line and how it's impacting them. So I think there was a lot going on in 2020.
Yeah, 2020 was a rough year. I think it exacerbated a lot of the inequalities that were there that I think so many ethnic minorities have been gaslit about. And it really took those sort of COVID rates of people dying for people to really wake up and say, wow, there is something here. How do we tackle it? But I think what was really great is that we did see a lot of medical professionals actually come up and speak out about it across the board, people that are working in those hospitals. So yeah, 2020 really pulled back the layers for a lot of people.
And if we're going to keep it on kind of the police for now, 2012 with the Stephen Lawrence case and report. So that was, I believe, the year that we saw two of the original suspects convicted. And that again was another moment and another reunited discussion around kind of police and the police practice here in the UK. So this issue is, I mean, we're not talking about just in the 20, because that happened in the 1990s, wasn't it?
Yeah, Stephen Lawrence was murdered in April 1993. The McPherson report didn't actually was conducted until 1996, and then we're seeing over a decade later in 2012, two of his murderers finally brought to justice, and the family finally get some sense of justice. So it's a very stark reminder that we're still so far off from achieving racial equality, and that case really does loom over us, especially for Black Britons. Worth pointing out as well about the Casey review and how that was very much contrasted in terms of the lack of progress that we haven't made, and the sort of inability to admit that there is institutional racism in the Met Police. So we're really in sort of a very weird sort of paradox time warp of movement that's not quite happening, moving in slow motion in a way is kind of the best way to put it.
Absolutely. But it's important to highlight that all of these moments that we're speaking of, in particular between 2010 and now, is because we've been under one party's led government for some time. So with looking at the upcoming manifestos, it's good to keep in mind, where is all of these campaigning? How far have we moved forward? And keeping it on the line of police, let's have a look at what's going on for women. So in 2021, and you've done a lot of writing about this, you can talk for days about this, but in 2021, the violence against women of color, the campaign led by Sister Space with the demand for the government to make mandatory training for the police and agencies to support Black women who are victims of domestic abuse. And of course, the new law, or the push for the new law, the Valerie's Law, to be created, like that hasn't really happened either. And I remember is in the Policing Bill Now Act, they did mention women, but perhaps you want to talk to us a little bit about where are we with that part of the campaign?
Yeah, certainly. So Valerie's Law is something I covered extensively when I was a journalist at The Voice. And like you mentioned, it's a law that is finally holding to account the police and government bodies, agencies, and how they interact and deal with Black women who are victims of domestic abuse and sexual violence across the board. So this incredible law that was drafted in the name of Valerie Ford, who was violently murdered by her ex-partner, is the first of its kind. We haven't got a law like this that looks at the intersectionality of both race and gender in the context of abuse. We've got the Domestic Abuse Act, which is a relatively updated act, but it fails to include those experiences of women of colour in particular. And this debate got to the Houses of Commons. It was a debate led by Abena Apong. I hope I'm pronouncing her name correctly. And she led that debate. It was a positive debate, but even before we got to the debate, the government already said they weren't going to mandate it. So they were already up against a lot. You know, I remember Valerie's family were also in the gallery at that debate as well when it happened. And since then, it was a great momentous occasion, but we haven't seen that action since then. I've been in conversations with Sister Space ongoing, and I think it's as much frustration on their end because of what's happened in government. We saw Rishi Sunak get into government in a very suddenly, and that really set the tide for things to not go as sort of smoothly as they'd wanted. We had a lot of things happening with the royal family at the time. Sister Space obviously dealt with their own sort of royal racism row, I guess you could say, quote unquote, and that really slowed down the trajectory of that. But also, I don't think it's worth saying it's a wider stance of like the government weren't interested in mandating this anyway. So it's up to sort of us to kind of really continue to bring this to the forefront. But we're going to get into that a bit later on the Racial Equality Act and how that could potentially aid victims of domestic and sexual violence.
Yeah, the one proposed by the Labour Party. Absolutely, we'll come back to that. So, okay, so what else have we got here to do with the police before we move on? Right, 2017. The David Lammy report and the failings to adopt the recommendations. I do believe we're still in a stage where the recommendations have been failed to be adopted. So that's another thing. We've got in 2018, so the year later, now we're moving into the workplace. There was a campaign, the ethnicity pay gap was created in 2018 with the demand for the government to make ethnicity pay gap reporting mandatory. And we are still awaiting that ask. Where else are we? Now we're into football and racism in 2019. So we're still a year later. We've got the Premier League's No Room for Racism campaign. And this is, and I know you know this as much as me because it was a moment in time, again, that we all remember. During the time when the footballers, they were taking a knee as a sign of support against the movement of racism. But in 2021, after England lost the UEFA, for me who don't really know football too well, Euros 2020 finals, we saw Saka, we saw Rashford, we saw Sancho receive a lot of racial abuse online for them for missing penalty kicks. Yeah. Do you remember that moment in time?
Of course, I remember. Yeah. I was watching it. That's the only time I watch football is when it's either the Euros or the World Cup. So I was there, and I just think I remember having a very lengthy conversation with my colleagues at the time, and we know it's racist, okay? And we know we're almost not. We're disappointed but not surprised.
Yeah.
But it started. It was more of a conversation of, is this a country that we should be sort of, that these footballers should feel proud to sort of be playing for in England, wearing an England t-shirt? That was a conversation. A lot of fans who are black and ethnic minority, they refuse to wear England t-shirts, even though football is meant to be such a game of bringing people together. That was often the conversations we had. And the fact that Raheem Sterling wasn't involved in that. And a lot of them were like, was that a part of it? Because he knew that the abuse that he would be facing. This is not a surprise to anybody. His football has a long history of racism in this country.
A long history.
A long history. John Barnes is a name that comes to mind, who's dealt with that sort of that series of having bananas thrown at him on the pitch. Is a name that springs to mind. So it was those wider conversations of, this is just giving them, when you slip up as a black person, this is the sort of ammunition now to turn it into a racial thing when it didn't ever need to be. But it's a wider conversation of.
No, absolutely. And it just kind of shows that if the problem has not been addressed, it's going to continue to repeat, is it not? So we're here again in this last decade of time where we're still seeing these issues quite prominent in football and in other spaces. So another thing, I guess, to see what the incoming government and pledges address around that. And just to kind of briefly mention some other things that are happening that would be interesting to see if it has been mentioned in the manifestos in a minute, is of course the issue of child Q. Child Q in 2023, and it's another issue around the strip and search on children. It's very good to highlight how much has taken place in the last 15 years, because the amount of things in regards to the anti-racism fight, it's just, it's good to keep track. So just as a quick reminder around the child Q situation, if you want to give a quick little highlight, Leah, on that.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, child Q again was something I covered quite a bit at The Voice. So child Q was a 15-year-old black girl who attended a school in Hackney. and she was sitting exams, and she was accused by a teacher who was around or maybe potentially invigilating the exam that she smelled of cannabis. Obviously, the girl denied this. She didn't have cannabis on her. They didn't listen, took her into a back room, and they basically called the police. So I think 4 officers attended. I think three female, one male, and it was 2 female officers that took her into a room in the school and strip searched her while she was on her menstrual cycle. And part of that strip search, that a lot of that what needs to be said, was that she was on her period and she was instructed to sort of bend over and cough while this happened, just to further add to that loss of dignity that this, quite frankly, a child experienced,
A child, of course, a
So,
child.
yeah. So this, I know that gets lost in sort of that adultification argument. So this obviously happened, and it didn't come out until a year or two later after a report had happened. So this had happened in a school like at least a year ago before it was revealed to the public. And obviously it caused outrage, and FOIs were sent off left, right, and centre from journalists. The Children's Commissioner also found that Black children overall are more likely to be strip searched out of that whole group. So it started a whole
6.5.
conversation.
It was
Yeah,
6.5, times.
Exactly. So it started a whole conversation of an aspect of policing that I don't even think people potentially were very aware of. We know about police brutality. We know about sort of brutality in police custody, the SUS laws, stop and search. Those have been very, very big, aspects of policing. I think for a lot of people, including myself, I've never thought about strip search, particularly on minors.
Children.
So it started a whole, it started a whole conversation about that, and it's an ongoing thing. The legal action against the school and the officers.
Right. Okay. So yeah, I think that's enough for us to go over. Of course, I did not add one of the biggest ones as well. 2018, the Windrush scandal, campaigning. That's the year that we had a public condemnation, which led to a government apology, and the resignation of the Home Secretary at the time, Amber Rudd. But again, renewed the conversation around the Windrush scandal, the lack of compensation payouts, and of course the review, which has the recommendations have yet to be acknowledged and acted out. So again, a lot's going on: football, immigration, ethnicity pay gap with the workplaces, down to strip searches of children. Yeah. So should we now get into what exactly is being pledged, and how are they meeting some of these kind of calls for action for a better Britain, for a more racially inclusive Britain? So should we probably start with, we could go with immigration first, seeing as we're kind of in the deep end already. Let's start with immigration. Okay, so immigration, Leah, do you want to just kind of give us an idea? And for those listening, Leah has done a lot of research and done all the reading for the Conservative and Labour manifestos, and I took on the Lib Dem and Green manifestos. So with that being said, Leah, do you want to tell us what the Conservs and Labour are saying on immigration?
Yeah, definitely. So immigration has been a massive talking point in UK politics and just mainstream media in general. We saw that really come to a head during Brexit, and sort of UKIP in particular really pushed that agenda, sort of anti-immigrant sort of conversation, shall we say, and debate. So overall, the Conservatives have been leading with the manifesto of Stop the Votes. So that is what they're trying to tackle. We've seen sort of illegal migration really sort of be at its highest level. Oh, can you hear that? Okay, sorry. I just had notifications. Come at illegal migration at its highest level under the Conservatives government, which is their promise to sort of tackle. So we've seen that in the very controversial bill, also known as the Illegal Migration Act, in which anyone that's passing through the English Channel on sort of a small boat, for example, will immediately sort of be basically shipped off to Rwanda on a flight with no chance of ever sort of being able to return to the UK to start a new life. And this was a scheme, this was a program that was rolled out under Priti Patel, who was the ex-Home Secretary, continued to be developed under Suella Braverman, and has finally been finalised by Rishi Sunak. Worth noting that this was so controversial, that this act was so controversial that it was initially ruled inhumane by the European Court. Before,
Yeah.
obviously, some details were changed around it for it to become legal. To this day, a flight has not taken off yet, but the Conservatives in their most recent manifesto have actually said that they hope to have flights going out by July. I know you want to touch on the Legal Migration Act a little bit more, but before we get to it, I just want to talk a little bit more about what they're sort of pledging in sort of the nuts and bolts of it all. And that's
Yeah,
the
go on.
end sort of refugees and asylum seekers being in hotels. They want to sort of shut that down and crack down on people smuggling. So they do acknowledge that there is a human element to this, that there are people that are crossing the channel through ways of sort of by force and not in the way that is the most sort of to their well-being. So they've acknowledged that massively. They do want to restrict visa access from other countries that don't work with the UK on national priorities, for example. So very much feeding into that idea that we all need to be aligned on sort of all British values, for example, and people that don't align with that, maybe this might not be a place for them to sort of look at settling. And they're very clear on returning people who have no legal right to be in the UK to their home country. And yeah, I know you wanted to touch on sort of that legal right aspect as well.
Well, yeah, I think having wording such as no legal right or, illegal migrants, it's just rhetoric, isn't it? Because where you have refugees and asylum seekers, I do believe, and listeners, you can absolutely always do your fact checking, always double check. And in this, by the way, this podcast episode will be uploaded as a blog piece with references. You can go and have a look yourself. With asylum seekers and refugees, if you are to seek refuge in a country, that is a right under the European conventions for human rights. So therefore, that you're not illegal. There's no such thing as an illegal migrant in that sense. It's just rhetoric to kind of give us a certain view on people. And really, if people are fleeing from their land, you have to really try and put yourself in the shoes of a person who's fleeing from their land. When you're fleeing from your land, it's not because you had extra time to make an application and call this one and arrange your flight. No, you're fleeing often without having any, not having a lot that you can take with you because you're fleeing. So it just kind of seems extremely inhumane, certainly without heart. And it kind of contrasts with some previous sayings that Britain is kind of the standard for human rights, and we should be used as the example, the international example of human rights. It does definitely contrast with that. And as you've already highlighted, we've already been England's or this current government's some of the things they're trying to do with the Rwanda bill has already been in trouble or condemned by international courts in the way that we're going about it. So in regards to kind of immigration and the Rwanda bill, though, Lib Dems, they have distinctly made a note of that and said they want to just cancel the scheme. They want to cancel the Rwandan scheme. And in fact, they want to create a new humanitarian travel permit. So this is to allow the asylum seekers to travel to the UK and then to proceed with their claims. However, the Greens, they have not distinctly said Rwanda scheme, but they did say they want to create safe passages, ways for people fleeing from danger from their own countries and allow them to work here in Britain whilst their case is being decided and have access to public money where suitable. So they're on completely different wavelengths, and the Lib Dem and the Green in regards to immigration and more asylum seekers and refugees. So what else is being said in immigration for Labour, and actually what is Labour saying about it?
Yeah, Labour is, I would say, from what you just said there, it's marrying up quite closely with the Lib Dems manifesto. So Labour are very keen to keep the Australian style that we often refer to as that the Conservatives have brought in under their tenure. So Australian style point system that basically just works in a way of, looks at the sort of caliber of the person before they're sort of given that sign off to enter into the country. What are the skills? Do they work? How long have they been working for, etc.? They plan to reform the Migration Advisory Committee to link into the body setting out industrial and skills strategy. So learning from that Australian style of approach to ensure that skill shortages are tackled sort of head on, with a plan to also upskill workers in the UK. And they also want to reduce the reliance on overseas workers, introduce new training plans and upskilling people. So there's a really big onus on progression and training. It's not a case of, you can't be here. You just, when you come here, you have to contribute, which I think is, it's pretty fair evaluation of a way to tackle those people that might want to sort of lean on the system in a way that's not, I guess, in the benefit of everyone else. That's their kind of way of hitting back against that rhetoric that we often hear on a wider conversation.
And just to interject there, just to make it completely clear for everyone listening, we're moving on to those who are migrating to the UK, rather refugees and asylum seekers. This is in regards to those who want to move to the UK as a decision that they have made, not because they're fleeing from war or any crimes or any sort of issues going on in their home countries. So yeah, continue, Leah.
Yeah, that's an important distinction to make. So this is kind of the system that Labour are wanting to sort of roll out. And in terms of illegal migration and boat crossings, I know that's obviously how we want to describe that one. But in terms of migration, kind of small boat crossings, they're pretty clear on sending people back when they don't have a legal right to be here. That is what they've laid out in their manifesto. But they've also caveated that by saying that wherever migrant countries these people, asylum seekers, refugees have come from, it's about sort of tackling what humanitarian issues are happening in their countries. So that could mean foreign aid. We might see a foreign aid budget by the Labour Party increase in that way. But I haven't seen that mentioned across the parties. So that might be an angle that the way that Labour are looking at it. They also promised to enforce a new cross-border police unit as well to sort of tackle those boat crossings as well. I just want to jump back on to some of what the Conservatives were saying. It's just also worth mentioning that in terms of migration, Conservatives sort of have said that they want to give Parliament more control of how many places are offered on safe legal routes to support those in genuine need from around the world, with a cap based on the capacity of local areas in which these migrants are coming from or wanting to stay in, etc. So they're looking at very sort of tangible ways in terms of dealing with having a control around the issue. And I think that's what they want to do. They want to try and control it in the best way possible. In terms of really reaching into that sort of human effort, I would definitely say that this is not something we've seen from the Conservatives massively. There's been quite divisive rhetoric around migration. I just want to sort of point on the fact that, ex-Home Secretary Suella Braverman, she often describes the migrants coming over as a swarm. We saw a lot of Labour MPs criticise that, as well as a lot of charities such as Stand Up to Racism, Hope Not Hate, Runnymede Trust. All these big racial equality think tanks and groups really condemned that messaging. And most recently, she described homelessness as a lifestyle choice. And obviously, if you're coming over as an asylum seeker and a refugee, oftentimes you're not going to have the support in place to help you. We've seen that through arguably manifestos in the past that have caused that in the first place, or current governments in recent years. So all of this is very divisive language that feeds into that idea of people that really need help are a strain on the system, that is very sort of not progressive in regards to that racial equality effort. So it's just worth noting that despite these pledges by the Conservatives hit and miss, we also have the underpinning of that rhetoric they have.
Well, I think what it really pulls to is if the attitudes of those in charge of what happens as part of the government in regards to you know how we deal with asylum seekers and refugees hold those sorts of opinions on people, then it kind of talks to the view of whether you see them as a person to help or whether you see them as a burden. And I think that kind of that then spills out into the action as well. So the words do hold power in terms of how people are viewed who come in these desperate situations. In terms of the Lib Dems, though, so I'm just going to go back on kind of some of the things you said. So in terms of migrants migrating to the UK, we currently have that Australian points-based system. So that's actually a salary threshold. So based on how much salary you make and then therefore how many points you earn and whether that means you are able to come to the UK or not, essentially. So the Lib Dems, they want to scrap that altogether and replace it with a flexible merit-based system for work visas. Now, that's as far as it's gone in terms of their manifesto. So it'll be interesting to see how that works. They also want to ban, and this is something that's extremely important, want to reverse the Conservative government's ban on care workers bringing their partners and children. And of course, reducing the cost, which is currently set at £1,214 to register a child as a British citizen, down to the cost of administration. So these are things that whilst, and I think it's quite interesting, isn't it? Because where there's a lot of shortages and gaps currently in various industries in the UK, we've seen where on one hand, we're said we need more British people to be more skilled in various areas where we have gaps in skills in order to take up these jobs. But at the same time, there's almost a bit of a call out to say, oh, can we please have more people come in who are skilled workers? We want to attract more skilled workers into the country in order to take and help and fill these positions. However, the law kind of defers from wanting people to come because it's like, oh, come work for us, but can you at the same time not bring your partner? And if you want to register your child, it costs a lot. And so it becomes a little bit difficult. It's just come here and work and that's it. That's all you need to do. So it's quite interesting. That. What else is being said here? The Lib Dems, they don't support the current government's hostile immigration policies. So instead, they are keen to invest. So just like you mentioned in regards to Labour, they are keen to invest in officers, training, technology, and tackle human rights crimes such as smuggling, trafficking, and modern slavery in order to get a hold of, illegal migration. But the emphasis really needs to sit in regards to trafficking and the people who are trafficking and smuggling rather than the people who are vulnerable and are trying to get away from danger, essentially. And I do believe the current government's current way of going about things is more towards punishing the people who are actually trying to get away. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think we've seen that in the manifesto. I do think that the Conservatives are trying to roll out ways in dealing with sort of the levels of migration we do have coming to this country. Is Rwanda the right way to do that? If you've had to change the law to do it, in my opinion, my personal humble opinion, probably not if it was ruled inhumane. I've seen that there's a lack of sort of onus on upskilling. It's not giving people that sort of opportunity. And I would guess for me to have had faith in that Conservative government, I would have at least liked to have seen some of that onus on really training people up to when they do come here, to really put them on their own 2 feet and give them that really good step forward to really contribute for their families and for themselves. So I'm not seeing that sense of building and development that I would like to see from the current government. But in terms
Absolutely.
of practicality, are they ending sort of occupation in hotels and accommodations? Yes, that's the case. Are they sending people back who are legally, I guess, by their terms, not allowed to be here? That is also a part of it as well.
All right, Tio. So let's go more distinctly into who's saying what in regards to racial equality. So, do you want to kickstart us off on what is, let's go with Labour, because I know they've established a Race Equality Act as part of their manifesto.
Yeah, so back in 2020, that was the height of the Black Lives Matter protest after the death of George Floyd. Labour rolled out plans to launch a Race Equality Act. We, of course, have the Equality Act 2010, which is obviously quite an updated act, but this act by Labour is really pledging to get to the sort of nuts and cranny of what a lot of Black and ethnic minority people are feeling. So, for example, a real onus on protected characteristics, looking at things such as dual discrimination, which is why I mentioned before things like Valerie's Law. Even though we were struggling to get that law into actual act, we have things like this law is proposing to also look at sort of race and gender in the same context. So when we do have cases that arise, the law is covering aspects such as that. It's also looking at, as you mentioned, the ethnicity pay gap and mandating that for companies of up to 250 employees to mandate recording and data around sort of that pay gap that affects Black and minority ethnic workers. We know that Black workers overall across the board are the most likely to be underpaid, and they're more likely to be on 0-hour contracts. In terms of sort of that, if we want to go even deeper into that demographic, it's Black Caribbean women that are probably the worst out of the whole sort of spectrum of ethnic minorities. So this law is a real, potentially a massive game changer to really tackle racial bias. And worth noting as well that Labour have also promised that the Windrush Lessons Learned Review and the LAMI Review will also be implemented into this law. And obviously, as you mentioned, the LAMI Review has not been implemented at all, and neither has been. So a huge promise from Labour, but where I think a lot of people are quite worried whether that's really going to come to fruition. And I say that because the law hasn't really been mentioned since that time. And once it did kind of come out into the woodwork again, as we run up to election period, it was an announcement made in February this year from Annalise Dodds, who's obviously a member of the party, that the act was still very much in progress. But we had a lot of people from the Labour woodwork come out, the National Executive Committee, who obviously look at Labour and govern them, express concerns that although this act is absolutely great, it's on paper, what about sort of tackling the wider far-right extremism, that hostile environment you mentioned, and plans to really tackle that thinking? Because we see all these laws being restructured, we see all these sort of manifestos rolling out, but where do we get from unless we're dealing with the psyches of people and that teaching of the colonial history? And that is something that Labour have not really set out in detail to really deal with the mentalities and psyches in these institutions that perpetuate these perpetuate discrimination on a daily basis. So they're calling for an independent review. We've seen that the hostile environment is very much alive and well in the recent protests we saw in London, where that absolutely horrible poster we saw that described London as like London Stan, as sort of a mocking affront to Sajid Khan, being one of the first Muslim mayors in London. It's worth also noting that the task force behind the act is quite credible. We have Baroness Doreen Lawrence and Jacqueline McKenzie, who's a human rights lawyer, particularly around minimums. But however, they both expressed concerns because even though they're on the task force, they allege that they haven't really been contacted within the last 6 months or so about the act and its process, and they feel quite shut out from the experience. And that's something that we worry about. We've seen that across the board with things like reparations, for example, that they're just not involving Black communities on a grassroots level to really implement, because we fear when things are implemented, they don't look at those dual characteristics and they blend us in with other groups who deal with other separate problems. For example, as we all know, BAME, that wonderful we've all had to import.
Wonderful word. The pick and mix
Yeah,
of all
so
people words. Yeah. What's it
absolutely.
called? Just kind of going off of some of the things you said there, whilst the act in, I guess, on the forefront, it appears like it offers a lot, but there has been a lot of criticism, hasn't there? Especially very, very recently with Diana Abbott, in regards to how the political party treats its own members of parliament, and that screams a
100%.
lot. It screams a lot in regards to, well, whilst you can have this act, how meaningful will it really be if you don't have a true understanding of racial racism? And it's kind of shown in the way that a very prominent MP, a prolific MP, is being treated by the party and by the leader of Labour. So yeah, it's definitely one to keep in mind that actions and words are two different things, right?
100%. Yeah,
Absolutely.
100%.
And actions speak louder than words. And I think in this occasion, there's a lot of bombastic side eye in regards to, is this really gonna do anything at this moment if we can't see that your house is in order, especially in regards to anti-Black racism, amongst other types of hate. But just to kind of add to what you're saying, for the Lib Dems and Green. So the Lib Dem also said that they will implement the Windrush lessons in full. And they've gone a step further and said that they will get the compensations paid, made by the independent from the Home Office, which is one of the big things that have been coming out, is saying, can we move the compensation away from the Home Office to roll out? And that's also been something that's not actioned currently. The Lib Dems have also moved forward with the conversation around domestic abuse. So they want to implement something called the Istanbul Convention on combating and preventing violence against women and domestic violence, with protection for all survivors, regardless of nationality and immigration status. I think the key word is regardless of immigration status, which is extremely important. In regards to that, also some sustainable funding for survivors of domestic abuse is also promised by the Lib Dems, with a particular focus on community-based and specialist by and for services. This has been the first time I've seen recognition of the by and for service, which is absolutely what is necessary and needed in communities, especially when it comes to very sensitive things such as domestic abuse. I will also add mental health. So Lib Dem, and I think we'll come back to this, so we'll leave this off, but they've also addressed what's going on in the media, and the media's kind of part played in inflaming racist kind of like rhetoric, but we'll come back to that. The Lib Dems, they have recognised that security measures for places such as worship, schools and community centres are vulnerable to hate crime and terror attacks, and has pledged to put some funding behind protecting. In the workplace, they have the Lib Dems for the workplace said that public workspaces should extend the name bind recruitment processes, and also encourage the private sector to do the same, with large employers being required to monitor and publish gender, ethnicity, disability, LGBTQ employment, pay gaps, and progress with a 5-year target. So they're proper like, you're reporting everything. You're reporting everything. And also for neurodiversity, they have pledged to put some support and advice for employers and put together a cross-government strategy on that. So, yeah. Now bringing it back to the international genocides that are taking place, the Lib Dems have recognized, of course, the Israel-Gaza conflict and said ceasefire, want to recognize Palestine as an independent state, something we've seen that's happening very slowly internationally. And push for a two-state solution based on the 1967 Borders Agreement. Also, there has been recognition in regards to creating safe and legal passages for those who wish to leave Afghanistan and support the Afghan refugees in the UK, increase the humanitarian assistance to Sudan, and play a stronger role in seeking a ceasefire there as well. So that's some of the things the Lib Dem have said. It's quite disappointing not to see any mention of Congo. I think this is going to be something that really needs to be campaigned harder for recognition. I think due to maybe some of the very big tech companies having their part to play is probably why there's so much silence around it. But yeah, that's the Lib Dems. And then as for the Green Party, they have pledged for worker rights. They've recognized, of course, the right to strike. They want to make that a new workers' right. And see equal pay be something. Sorry, the right to have to see equal rights, to see worker rights be implemented from day one. Apologies for that. So there's a lot of rights in regards to being, an employee that kick in later on after you've shown that you've worked at a certain workplace for a certain amount of time. For anyone who, and something that's even personal to me, for instance, if you were to work in a workplace for less than 2 years and you faced a situation where you were forced to leave your job, you can't exactly, you don't have any rights to legally to stand and say, well, I was fired illegally. It's not illegal until you've worked over 2 years, and then all of a sudden it's now illegal. So that's very interesting. So it'll be good to see some equal rights from day one for workers. So that's what's going on for the Greens and the Lib Dems in regards to racial equality. Quite a bit is recognised, but a lot and long ways to go, to be honest, in regards to that. It's quite interesting, though, isn't it, the contrast of pledges when you line them up in terms of who's saying what in terms of racial equality, how far some are going, how little some are doing.
Yeah, but also alongside their pledges, it's also looking at their track records as well to really cement what they're saying and whether people can really trust and put their vote in them this year. Like, for example, Labour for so many years has been held up as the party for working class, left-leaning people across the board. And for so long, they've held on to strongholds across the UK, particularly for Black and Muslim voters, who often felt that they had a voice there in Labour. And in recent times, that's sort of kind of very curtailed. I say that because of the recent Israel-Palestine conflict that we've seen, and Keir Starmer's sort of hesitation to call for a ceasefire immediately, and sort of defended Israel's right to defend itself. A lot of British Muslims here in the UK felt that very strongly that was the wrong move, and that's just because we know that we know we've seen from that conflict that's happening, that a lot of it is tied to Islamophobia. It's tied to sort of racism of these people of a darker hue that are suffering. We saw that rhetoric being peddled out when we saw the Ukraine and Russia conflict kick off. So it's nothing that we haven't seen before. It's a very nuanced conversation that you really have to listen and look for. So the Muslim vote in sort of Labour's corner, I would say that it's low. It's in fact a poll by a survey from the Labour Muslim Network actually found that 86% of British Muslims supported Labour at the last election, compared to 60% now who feel that they're not going to support Labour at this election. And a lot of them are actually probably not even voting, to be honest with you. So Labour have very much lost sort of that faith in sort of the British Muslim vote, as well as the black vote. Like you mentioned, we saw that treatment from Diane Abbott. She was accused of anti-Semitism in an article she wrote for The Observer, also known as The Guardian. And she had the whip removed, which was recently restored to her. I don't know if you want me to go into a bit of detail about that article and what was said in
it. Sure.
We've got time. Yeah, so Diane Abbott, one of the first black women MPs in Parliament, she wrote an article for The Observer in which she described the discrimination that Jewish people face, and she very clumsily likened it to sort of discrimination that redheads face, which even I would admit was very invalidating to what Jews have experienced. That was completely the wrong example to use. But between all that sort of clumsy wording, anyone who is sort of racially educated would have seen through what she was saying, that she was trying to make a point of of sort of anti-black racism and how skin color plays a part in our experiences and that proximity to whiteness. And that's a point that's been made a lot of times, for example, Russia, Ukraine, and how people didn't see them as victims because they weren't, and I quote, light with blue eyes, etc. And I think that was a very nuanced thing that she was trying to make. I'm not saying I agree with it. I'm not saying that we agree with it across the board. I'm just saying that was the interpretation of the comment, and how a lot of people who were not for her having the whip removed saw that comment. We saw Kate Osama, who was ousted after calling the Israel-Palestine conflict a genocide. Also, I would admit, very clumsily on Holocaust Memorial Day. Incredibly insensitive timing, but also worth mentioning that the same day she called it a genocide was the day that the International Court of Justice declared the same and called it a genocide. And we've also seen the recent treatment of Faiza Shaheen, who was also removed from the party and is now running as an independent after liking a tweet from a US presenter, Jon Stewart, who kind of made light of anyone who sort of criticizes the current conflict on Israel's sort of side is immediately silenced. So it really feeds into that sort of hierarchy of racism that the Labour Party were accused of perpetuating in the Ford report, which was conducted by Martin Ford QC, and how there was certain groups, marginalized groups, who are all dealing with discrimination, hasten to add, and one's being prioritized over the other. Just looking at sort of the members of the party who are trying to speak up, they all are of colour and they've all been very silenced. So a lot of people, from just observing that and just feeling like they can't even say that in itself, just from that observation, a lot of voters feel like they don't have the faith that had in Labour for Black and Muslim voters across the board, I would say.
Yeah. Indeed, but just to kind of go on the basis of, just to add on to what you said a second ago about people of marginalized ethnic backgrounds and their trust in politics. So there was a recent it's called the UK Trust Barometer, revealed that only 30% of Britons trust the government, which is the lowest since 2012. That's actually really bad. And the majority, which is 66%, view the government as completely ineffective. And 69% think that it only serves specific groups, with 63% deeming it corrupt and biased. But talking more specifically about, and dare I say it, BME, groups, because we all hate grouping terms, but in this instance, we are talking about a collective of marginalized ethnic groups here in the UK. In 1997, 3/4 of voters of all major BME groups supported Labour. Now, by 2010, the proportion has dropped significantly, especially amongst Indian and Pakistanis. And since then, the trend has accelerated. It's not really shocking, if I'm being perfectly honest, because if we were to look back at just some of the scandals that's happened in the last decade or just over a decade, it's easy to question whether our votes matter or whether, our government system is really acting in the interest of the people on the ground. So I think we can just swiftly move into a very, very important thing to highlight, which I think a lot of the media are skating away from, as we hear all the time, vote, vote, vote. Should we talk a little bit about, do our votes even matter? And why? So again, just like how we started the podcast episode, let's remind ourselves of what's happened in the last 15 or so years before we make a very, very important decision on the 4th of July, which is the general election day. So the scandals that have taken place in recent times, and we have seen, and I laugh as I say some of this because I can almost remember all of my emotions and my own reactions to some of these news. So, do you remember this time, Leah, when we had the special advisor to the PM, Dominic Cummings, when he broke the very rules the government set out strictly regarding traveling at the height of COVID? If you can remember, I think it was a cross, just a big long travel to go home, I think it was. And it was, in fact, the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, who stated this, and he broke his own rule and consequently his marriage when we all found out he was grabbing bum and lipsing up in his ministerial office.
And to this day, we still don't know who actually leaked that footage.
To this day.
To this day.
Scandal. So that was one big scandal in the height of when we were, as a country, at our most vulnerable, because if you didn't care about politics, I tell you one thing, a lot of us were tuned in. Whenever they said special announcement at 6, we were like,
we were there.
At 6, yeah. On the dot. We were so vulnerable as a country, and we really, really put our faith into our government system to lead us out of this. So let's continue, shall we? We've also had in 2021, we've seen sexual misconduct scandals, where Rob Roberts, who's a Conservative MP for 12 weeks, was suspended for over 12 weeks over repeated sexual misconduct, and then later was able to join the party just about 5 months later. Okay. We've also had the wallpaper gate, and that was £112,000 spent on wallpaper, and it was alleged it was not known where the money would come from. Yeah. We saw where Owen Paterson, who is a lawmaker and Conserve MP, he resigned after repeatedly breaching lobbying rules by advocating for 2 companies he was paid over 100,000. And on top of this, we saw the government halt the investigation process and force through a change to the process of the investigation of lawmakers in attempt to save Owen. So that's... I don't know. Carry on.
I just wanted to mention as well Partygate from the sort of COVID scandal as well, and how that sort of erupted we saw the then Prime Minister Boris Johnson obviously engage in what he called meetings, which ended up being a series of parties. And that was an expose by the Mirror, who exposed sort of what was going on in government at the time. And we saw an array of fines go out across government, and we saw our own Prime Minister Rishi Sunak also admit to having been working, quote unquote, during that time when he was obviously caught out. And he's apologised, but whether trust has been restored 100%, we're not entirely sure. So that was a very big scandal that a lot of people still feel the reverberations of it are still very much felt today.
And just to add on to that as well, Simon Case, which is a senior civil servant who chaired the investigation, the exact investigation into Partygate, was later found that he hosted it in December 2021.
Are you joking?
So
I didn't know.
I did my research. I did my research, and I will reference everything I've said.
A guy that did the quite
who chaired the investigation into Partygate, and later it was found he hosted it.
That's wild.
And this is very important. It's because it's laughable why we just allow these things to happen. But no.
Can I also just make a point to say that I think the effects of COVID is, as much as Rishi Sunak did roll out as the Exchequer, as the Chancellor, he did roll out the furlough scheme and Eat Out to help out. And those from an economical side were brilliant of him. You could really see him tap into investment banking background in that regard in terms of how he tackled that. But I think, me personally, I think we're really seeing the consequence of Partygate and the very raw and vivid memories people have from that COVID period, which wiped out a lot of us, me included. And we've seen that in the most recent polls, YouGov polls actually, that Labour is actually leading in sort of around 20 points more ahead of the Conservatives currently in general sort of opinion, like good opinion of sort of the parties. And even Reform UK, who's been headed up by Nigel Farage, who just recently announced that he was running, very, very late to the party, but he has announced that he's in the running, is currently on 19%, who's just 1 point ahead of the Conservatives. And they're followed by the Lib Dems and the Greens. So we're seeing a shift here that after having a Tory government for over 10 years, you know, I remember when they slashed like EMA and like the Brexit vote, for example, where we might be seeing a return of potentially very left-wing value. I say potentially because there's arguments that Keir Starmer is very centre-left, but we could be seeing the return of a very left-wing centre-right. My bad, sorry. Centre-right. We could be seeing the return of a Labour government potentially because of the effects of COVID.
Well, just to kind of move on, are any of the manifestos, the parties were obviously trying to get our votes, are any of them making any sort of acknowledgement of the trust, the lack of trust, the loss of trust in our political system? Well, for the Lib Dems, they have made some recognition of that. So they also said that they want to make it a requirement for political parties to publish candidate diversity data as a means to start looking into meaningfully what's going on there. And outside of that, hold on as I scroll. Here we are. The Lib Dems, they want to make votes matter. So this is something that a campaigning group have been campaigning for some time. It's called the Make Votes Matter campaign. Well, the Lib Dems have tapped into that and they want to introduce proportional representation as our new voting, our voting kind of system. We're currently under first past the post, and I'll talk about that later. And that would be interesting if that was to happen. Did Labour say anything around political reform or voting reform?
I haven't come across anything in terms of like voting reform, political reform now. But
Okay.
The only reform, yeah, we've got obviously the Equality Act and the immigration where they've proposed like some drastic reforms in regards to that, but not in terms of voting.
And the Conserves?
No, same for that one.
Right, okay. Well, with the Lib Dems, they also want to address the lacking trust in the UK's political system by making transparency requirements and strengthening standards, such as the process to appoint significant public roles. So this is very interesting because this is one of the criticisms we saw, at least with the Dominic Cummings situation. He was appointed directly by our PM at the time, Boris Johnson. So yeah, the Lib Dem want to put a standard and a process in place in regards to appointing significant public roles, by needing a confirmatory vote from the relevant select committee. They want to put in some annual anti-sleaze training for ministers and WhatsApp.
Wow.
They want
And
to make recording of government business done on WhatsApp quarterly published. I don't know if that's publicly quarterly published or just for them, but who knows? And they want to
anti
push, yeah, anti-sleaze training. Yes, it's at that point, but you look, something needs to be done, okay? And they also want to push for a public convention on disinformation and electoral interference, which is quite interesting to go the global approach. I think maybe it's because across the pond there's also been some conversations around disinformation and the spread of that. So yeah, that's the Lib Dems. The Greens also have some political reforms in their manifesto. They want to change the House of Lords. They want to scrap it, essentially. Want to scrap the House of Lords, which is quite big, and make it into kind of like people who have been voted for. So yeah, make it a place where, I guess, a house of people who we vote for. I don't know if it's us as members of the public or how that would work, but yeah, that's the pledge there. And they want to just outright rejoin the EU. So that's quite big. Whilst the Lib Dem have moved towards working more with the EU. So yeah, that's some of the political reforms. There's more from the Lib Dems. I'll add it here since we're talking about it. Want to protect whistleblowers from establishing a new office of the whistleblower and create new legislation to protect and promote greater public awareness of their rights. Thank you. That would do us a job. The Lib Dem also want to uphold the European Convention of Human Rights and resist any attempts to withdraw. And to make caring protected characteristics in the Equality Act 2010. And they want to scrap the voter ID scheme, which I think is something that every single party needs to put in their manifesto, to be honest. So yeah, that's some of the kind of addressing the issue, the very big elephant in the room, which is, do our votes even matter? But whether you vote or not, which I definitely am an advocate of voting doesn't necessarily mean that all our problems are over with whoever is, even if the party you hope for is elected. It's very much a basis of who do we at least think will listen to us a little bit more. Because as we've seen, even with this current government, there has been things that have been changed and it wasn't necessarily set out in their manifesto or things and list of things to do. Yeah, we've seen lots of U-turns. So our votes matter, and so do campaigning, is all I can say. Our votes and campaigning absolutely matters. But ineffective, not voting also matters, because otherwise we would not be out the EU right now.
Yeah, of course, we saw that. Yeah, I was gonna just, I was gonna massively touch on that. that when Brexit first became a conversation under David Cameron's government, oh my goodness, that was how long ago it was.
Yeah,
I think for a lot of people, myself included, is very guilty of this.
2019. It's not that far ago.
That no. When it actually all was done and dusted, 2019, yeah, was I don't think people took it very seriously. I don't think people thought this is actually going to happen. This Brexit thing, like we're never going to leave the EU. It was such a very weird time when Donald Trump was also running was running for president. So I don't think we
Absolutely.
actually saw it actually changing our lives in the way that it did, and it massively did. And I feel like I do actually regret not voting. Yeah, whether it made a difference, I don't know, but I think it really, for me, it reminded me and so many others that politics isn't so far away. It really is on
Hmm.
our doorsteps, and it does
Hmm.
affect your everyday. But just also to stress the point that even though it does can feel like Westminster can feel very alien to a lot of people, especially in working class communities, in rural communities, I would urge you all to get in touch with your local MPs in your constituencies, build relationships with them.
Hmm.
Even though there's issues happening in central government across the board, there's also a lot of localized campaigning and issues you can get involved in if you want your voice to be heard. Sometimes it
Hmm.
really does work being on that localized level. Is something I would also urge for those who may be feeling very pushed out or doubtful about voting. I also just wanted to draw on some stats from the 2019 elections, according to the BBC, that
Go ahead.
overall, 15.5 million people in the 2019 general election did not vote. I'm in those stats somewhere, unfortunately. And and that was the overall figure, followed by obviously the Conservatives and winning the election. So they followed very closely, followed by Labour, Lib Dems, and Greens, etc.
Hmm.
Um, and that's it's not a thing we want to see. So it's very important for us to be politicized and to be involved in this, and not to be sort of I I'm very much guilty of it. I was someone that didn't grow up in a very political household, and
Hmm.
it really does, even though I'm very political in my work, taking that extra step to actually cast a vote and show up to a voting booth is a very different experience. So, but I would actually urge everybody to vote, to be honest with you, because it's one chance you can have your say in something that as we can clearly see nowadays, and the years that have gone by, has very real effects on our everyday. So at least there's one element you can take back control of. Like I say, campaign on a local level is very, very important as well.
Absolutely. I'll just add to that and just kind of, I guess, extend it a bit. This is your one chance, perhaps every general election, to directly have your voice heard, but it's certainly not the end of having your voice heard, as we've seen with multiple campaigns that have taken place. Even I'm going to say his name all wrong because I'm not a football person. Oh no, save me here, Leah. Marcus
Marcus
Radford.
Rash, Mar-
Yeah,
Marcus Rashford.
thank you so much, and no disrespect whatsoever. Um, Phenomenal campaigning has led to the government doing a U-turn, very embarrassingly doing a U-turn. So we have seen how campaigning and people's voices can really make a change all the way at the top, anywhere from even the local level right up. So yeah, this one vote, it matters a lot. Like you said, we've seen the biggest impact with the EU
Oh yeah.
referendum. Oh my gosh, yeah,
Mm.
that was massive. And you were talking about if if you had voted, whether that would have made a difference. Let me just tell you something right now, girl.
Mm. Mm.
There was 15.5 million people who did not vote in the general election in 2019. And the
Yeah.
vote was so tight. It was 13.9 million for Conserves and 10.3 for Labour, right? So that's how
Mm.
tight of a vote it really was in regards to. And at that time, it was not about who the Conservatives and what they pledged, or the Labours and what they pledged. It was very firmly about, are we staying and are we leaving? That was the main kind of idea behind who you vote for and what their stances were. So does it matter to vote? Absolutely. Absolutely, it does, because when a manifesto has been set out, as we have seen, whether you agree with the contents of it or not, that is what whoever comes into the political, who comes into government, who forms the government, is going to set out to do. So whether you agreed with it or not, whichever side you'll sit, is either you're going to have to end up campaigning real hard to make some U-turns and some changes, or you're going to sit and be happy because you voted and you were happy with the result. So voting absolutely matters in that regard. So I guess we can kind of close this out. We can kind of close this out with just a few things, which is there are a lot of campaigns happening here in the UK in regards to anti-racism, in regards to hostile environments for migrants, refugees, asylum seekers. And we highlighted quite a lot of it, from the ethnicity pay gap. We just highlighted a lot of it. So where you stand and which party is doing the most for people of marginalized ethnic backgrounds, I hope that this podcast episode has helped at least to give you an idea of where each political party stands on that. So if you need a reminder of this, again, going to put this into a blog, which you can find on In Society's website, so you can read it if you're more of a reader, or follow our social media where we'll put it out in bite-sized content. And that's all I can say, is go out and vote on the 4th of July and make your voices heard, and never lose hope, because a campaign is what we can do next. All right.
Backup plan B.
Absolutely. Keep it going. The voice will always be heard. All right. Well, thank you, Leah, for joining me for this podcast episode. It was great speaking with you. Hopefully we get to speak with you again on more things in the future, all things political and economic. And any last words? Well, for the
Thank
podcast.
You for having. Yeah,
that turned morbid real quick.
Morbid, yeah.
Yeah.
No, thank you for having me. It was really good to get into the nuts and bolts of all this, and I really hope it's been helpful to viewers. There's so much more we could have touched on, and there's so much more we will touch on, and I hope it really informs people's votes moving forward. So yeah, brilliant.
Awesome. Closing and out.